So what you're looking at in front of you isn't merely a simple image. It is the interaction between the medical device that we're going to be talking about today and billions upon billions of different protons within the human body, more specifically the brain in this instance, as you can see over here. And then a bunch of different reconstruction techniques, processing, field correction, alignment, smoothings, and so on and so forth, have created images such as these ones in order for us to be able to enable medical professionals and healthcare providers to diagnose diseases and treat diseases with no surgeries, no trauma, no tools, no needles, none of that. Just pure physics interacting with engineering. Now, we have all seen an MRI scanner, and we have all been inside an MRI scanner. And in today's crash course, we're going to be closing the gap of what actually happens within an MRI scanner when it's working. Because a lot of different people know the actual device, they have been in the device, but they don't understand what happens beneath and within this medical device when it's working. So within today's crash course, we're going to be closing that gap forever. Whether you're a biomedical engineer, someone who's about to become a biomedical engineer, a clinical engineer, or someone who likes to learn about medical equipment and technology, this crash course is for you. We're going to be learning about the MRI scanner, what it is, the core functionality as you can see in front of you, how it works. We're going to be looking at the components. We're going to be diving deep into the components. We're going to be looking at the hydrogen protons within the body at the atomic level, what happens there, and how the MRI scanner actually forms an image and how that image actually looks at the end. So firstly, as you can see, we're using our beloved BM Essentia platform, the world's first biomedical engineering learning ecosystem, operating system, or learning biomedical institution. And we are over at the magnetic resonance imaging masterclass or device module. We have a bunch of different sections that we can look at: overview, operations, importance, the physics of the MRI device, features, applications, physiology, and so on and so forth. And if I, for example, press this image over here, it talks about the training gap, what every new MRI technologist gets wrong, and how it costs patients, hospitals, and careers, and a bunch of different angles of explanations about the MRI medical device. And we have an extensive library with over 70 medical devices. So firstly, let's look at the actual core functionality of the MRI medical device. In the simplest, most easiest way possible, the body's content is almost 70% water. And from water, we only focus on the hydrogen nucleus or the hydrogen protons. These protons look like little spinning tiny magnets. We call them little spins, spinning tops, magnets, whatever they are. They behave like tiny magnets within the body. And when you basically place a patient inside the MRI scanner, for example, as you can see from this image over here, the patient is placed in this position, as you can see. This is the superconducting magnet, or the superconducting magnet makes up the widest, biggest portion of the MRI's bore. There is a main magnetic field that is created from the superconducting magnet. Most of the time it is around 3 Tesla. The main magnetic field's direction is upwards, directed towards the longitudinal plane, which is perpendicular to the patient positioning, which is along the transverse plane, as you can see. Now, what happens is when the patient lies down, all of these little tiny proton spins, some of them are downwards, some of them are upwards, some are downwards, whatever they are, all of these little magnets will naturally align perpendicularly and be at the resting equilibrium state, which is upwards or downwards along the main magnetic field's direction, due to the main magnetic field exerting the effect and forces on the patient when they are lying down on the scanner. What happens is when we apply an RF pulse with a specific component over here in this area, which is known as the RF coils. Now, without going into much detail about the RF pulses, just know that when the RF pulses are applied, all of these hydrogen proton spins or little magnets that were aligned with the main magnetic field perpendicular to the patient positioning will now be tipped to become parallel to the patient positioning. So it was previously like this, now it is going to look like this, and then it is going to look like this, and then finally it looks like this, which is perpendicular to the patient positioning, as you can see over here. And then the RF pulse is cut or is stopped or is shut, and then these will have to return back to the original position, which is the position over here. And in this time going back to the original position, we get echoes, which are the signals. Now we'll go into much detail when we talk about it, but this in the most general form is what the core functionality of the MRI medical device is. As you can see, the machine operates by exploiting the magnetic properties of the hydrogen atoms, the little proton spins that we talked about, which are abundant in the human body due to the high water contents within the tissues. The hydrogen nuclei, which are the protons, they behave like tiny magnets within the body, and when they are placed within the strong magnetic field from the superconducting magnets, they are forced to align with the direction of the field, which is perpendicular to the patient positioning, as we said, which is upwards toward the longitudinal plane. The core functionality of the MRI machine is based on its ability to manipulate these protons briefly after they are aligned, which, what I said is, when we apply the RF pulse, they are tipped into becoming parallel with the patient positioning, and then we stop the RF pulse, and then they basically move backwards to their same original position. And in that time is where echoes or signals are emitted when they are returning back to their original state. This is in essence the core functionality of the MRI scanner. Now if we were to look at the actual components, which is the second part, if I can find the actual image, which I want to talk about. So the components of the MRI scanner. So the MRI scanner has three different layers, which basically we like to group them over here at BM Essentia when it comes to components. We have the outermost layer, which is the superconducting magnet, and then we have the second layer, which is the gradient coil layer, and then we have the closest layer to the sample table and to the actual bore entry and to the actual patient, which is the radio frequency coils, which we said are going to basically transmit radio frequency at a specific frequency in order for it to be able to match the frequency of the protons that are in the equilibrium state, that are aligned within the perpendicular direction. So firstly, we have the magnet, which is the outermost layer, which is the superconducting magnet over here. So it is this area, as you can see over here. It is a massive coil, which is cooled by liquid helium to absolutely zero. It ranges from 1.5 to 3 Teslas, and it exerts a main magnetic field, which is perpendicular to the patient positioning, which is known as B node, or you can call it the net magnetization vector, which is a main magnetic field. This main magnetic field influences all of the proton spins of the patient, which is lying on the MRI machine, to follow and fall within its same direction. Now, secondly, we have the gradient coils. Now, for the gradient coils, I need to move you over away from the MRI masterclass, and I need to take you to the MRI physics course from our 22 plus connected course curriculum in order for us to understand. And this is a nice little moment which I like to stop at and say that when we have built the platform, it was an architecture of basically connecting every single aspect, every single course, every single device, and every single explanation together. So we're actually looking at it live, as you can see, when I basically exit the MRI medical device masterclass and I go into the MRI physics course, as you can see over here, and then we go into chapter number 4's illustration gallery specifically, and then we look at the types of gradient coils, and I put you back onto full screen and we look at the types of gradient coils. Now with gradient coils, we have 3 different types of gradient coils. They are the second layer out of the 3 layers. We have the superconducting magnet gradient coils, and then the closest are the RF coils. For the gradient coils, we have x-axis gradient coils, z-axis gradient coils, and y-axis gradient coils, or x, y, and then z. So let's go for x, y, and then z. As you can see, x-axis gradient coils, they are located on the left and right sides of the patient's bore. So this is the bore. You're looking at it from this view over here, you have gradient coils on the left side and gradient coils on the right side, and they are used for frequency encoding in axial imaging and slice selection in sagittal planes. Now, before we go deeper, I just want to talk about what gradient coils actually are, because we haven't mentioned it. So what gradient coils actually do in the simplest, easiest way possible is that, for example, this is a part of the patient which we are imaging and we want to create images for using the MRI machine. Now, every single part, let's say that this is a specific part of a person. Let's say this is their back, for example, or the abdominal area. Now, we're not just going to be applying RF pulses and then getting signals and then seeing the image. It is a lot deeper and more nuanced than that. And this is where the gradient coils actually come in. What they do is that for every single little precessing spinning top or magnet or proton, as we said, it has a specific frequency, it has a specific phase encoding, it has a specific location within the body or within the area that we're imaging. And the actual scanner, when it is creating the image, needs to know the exact location of every single one of these little spinning tops in order for it to be able to create a full, uniform, correct image. This is where gradient coils come in. They basically do phase encoding and frequency encoding, which are basically vertical axis encoding and horizontal axis encoding, in order for the resulting RF signal to be a superimposed waveform of all the voxel contributions, which is then converted into a 2D matrix of image pixels in order for us to be able to see a full uniform image where every single part of basically the area of the patient that was imaged is in its exact perfect location. So we're basically creating pixels. These pixels will align in order for them to create a full image. Think of it as a puzzle. You're basically imaging the person, and then for every single hydrogen proton, it is at a specific location within that person's body or within the area which you're imaging. And then you're basically taking it and connecting it to the image in that exact specific location by doing phase encoding and frequency encoding in order for the image to be uniform. So this, in a nutshell, what gradient coils actually are. And there are three different types of gradient coils: X-axis gradient coils, Y-axis gradient coils, and Z-axis gradient coils. Now, for Y-axis gradient coils, they are positioned at the top and the bottom of the actual bore. Z-axis gradient coils, they are circular coils at each end of the bore. Without the gradient coils, we won't be able to know the exact location of every single proton spin within the area that we're imaging in order for us to be able to translate it over and create a perfect image of that specific part or of the entirety of the human body when using the MRI machine. So now, moving back into the components, we had the superconducting magnet, the gradient coils, and then the radio frequency coils, which are the closest to the patient. Now, what the radio frequency coils do is two specific things. They are either transmitter radio frequency coils, so they transmit and fire RF frequency at a specific frequency that needs to match the precessional frequency of the proton spins, and then they receive the echoes or the signals that are created after the gradient coils have actually worked and have gone through and gave us the specific location of every single proton spin in order for the system to create an image. And then we have the actual bore, which is the entry, and then we have the sample table, which manipulates the patient's anatomy. Now, this is all cool and we understand, but let's move a level deeper. Let's look at the actual magnets, the actual protons, and what they are. All you need to know in essence is that this is the main magnetic field, which is perpendicular. This is the magnetic moment or the proton or the spin or the magnet, whatever it is. It is spinning in random directions before the patient enters the main magnetic field, before the patient enters the MRI scanner, and it is also spinning around its own axis. So if you have a little spinning top and then you spin it, it keeps on spinning around its axis, and it is also spinning and wobbling. The spinning around the axis is called precession. And what we need to make out of this illustration over here is one very important thing. When the patient enters the main magnetic field, all of these spinning tops, these ones that were random, spinning in random directions, they start to align with the main magnetic field, either upwards or downwards. But they aren't fully perfectly aligned, but you don't see some of them going to the left, some to the right, some upwards but a bit to the left. They're either almost upwards or almost downwards in two directions, and that is it. So now let's move a level deeper. We talked about precession, which is basically, as you can see over here, this is the orbit of precession, which is basically the rotation of the nucleus around its own axis. And then there is the rotation of this nucleus or this proton or this magnet in multiple different random directions. Now we said that the RF pulses need to fire at a specific frequency that should match the precessional frequency of these proton spins. Only when the RF pulses frequency matches the precession frequency of these spins, which is the frequency of the spinning, then do these spins align perfectly, and then they tip over and then they come back again, as we talked about in the beginning of this crash course, and then we get the signals or the echoes, as you know. Now, how do we know the specific frequency that the RF pulses should align exactly and fire at, which is basically the same frequency as the precession of the spinning protons? It is known by a specific formula known as the Larmor frequency equation. It is Larmor frequency is equal to the gyromagnetic ratio, which is a set number, multiplied by the main magnetic field's strength. The main magnetic field, which is the main magnetic field that is created from the superconducting magnet. It is known as B node. It is dependent on the actual scanner used. Let's say 3 Tesla for now, so we know that. Now, what is the gyromagnetic ratio? It is a set ratio of 42.58 megahertz per single Tesla. So we multiply 42.58 by the main magnetic field, which is 3 Tesla, and then we get a random number. I haven't calculated it. Let's say 82 megahertz per Tesla. So 82, for example, is the precessional frequency at which the protons are precessing and wobbling about their own axis. So in order for us to be able to get them all aligned and in phase, we need to apply an RF pulse from the RF coils that is exactly 82 in order for it to match the 82, which is the Larmor frequency, the frequency of the spinning protons. And only when that happens do these protons actually are aligned, and then they start tipping out of alignment, and then the image starts being formed. So now finally we move on to the final slide and to the final missing piece in order for us to make sense of what we have learned today, which is T1 and T2 relaxations. We have T1 relaxation, which is recovery of longitudinal orientation or magnetization, and then T2 relaxation, which is the loss of transverse magnetization. So in order for us to be able to understand how an image is formed head to toe and to be able to relate it with T1 and T2, I have divided it into 4 different parts. We have 1, which is equilibrium. We have 2, which is RF on, RF applied. 3 is RF off, so we cut off the RF frequency. And then 4 is basically signal acquisition. So 4 different parts. We have equilibrium, RF on, RF off, and then signal. What is happening in every single one of these parts? Let's look at equilibrium first. So equilibrium is basically when the patient enters the scanner, and this is the patient lying. The scanner is creating a main magnetic field which is perpendicular to the patient positioning, which is B node. All of the proton spins are being aligned either upwards or downwards with the main magnetic field. So they are all aligned with the net magnetization vector or the main magnetic field. This is equilibrium and this is perfect. And they are set up for the second part of the 4-step or 4-part sequence. Now, part number 2 is RF on. So we apply the RF pulse. Now, what happens when we apply the RF pulse? the proton spins that were all aligned with the main magnetic field direction will now be tipped over into the transverse plane, which is parallel to the patient positioning. So now, instead of being aligned upwards with the main magnetic field, the perpendicular to the patient positioning plane, the longitudinal plane, they will now tip over to become parallel with the patient positioning, as you can see. And one more thing that will happen is that all of these proton spins will now become in phase. They will become homogeneous and they will all spin at the same precessional frequency. So they have been tipped over and then they start becoming homogeneous and all spinning in the same direction at the same exact speed. And then step 3 is that we cut the RF pulse off. What happens is two things, and this is where T1 and T2 actually come in fully. So after the RF pulse is cut, now what happens are two things. Firstly, T1 happens, which is the recovery of the longitudinal orientation or magnetization. What does that mean? We said the RF pulse has been applied, the net magnetization vector of the main magnetic field has tipped over to become parallel with the patient positioning. Now it has been cut off, so it needs to go back up again to the original position or orientation. So it was firstly perpendicular, RF pulse has been applied, it became parallel, and then the RF pulse has been cut off, it needs to become perpendicular again. This movement back into the original position is called recovery of longitudinal magnetization, because you're recovering the longitudinal magnetization, you're recovering back to the longitudinal plane again. Now this is basically, think of it as recharging. It takes a long time and you're recharging back to the full original state. What happens as well simultaneously is T2, which is the dephasing part, which is loss of transverse magnetization. What do we mean? The transverse plane is the plane which is parallel to the patient positioning, which is this plane. When we applied the RF pulse, the net magnetization vector went into this plane and it became parallel to this transverse plane. Why did that happen? Well, we said because now the protons have all been homogeneous, in alignment, in phase, and all spinning at the same speed. When we cut the RF pulse, firstly, recovery of the original position happens, which is T1, and then secondly, all of these proton spins will experience varieties within the speed, and they will all start dephasing. So every single one of these protons will now spin randomly at random speeds because there is no RF pulse. So what happens is the transverse magnetization is being lost because the longitudinal magnetization is being gained. Because the RF pulse has been applied, we went into transverse magnetization, the RF pulse has been cut off, the protons will now dephase, and when the protons dephase, as they are dephasing, now we are moving back from the transverse plane up into the original position, which is the longitudinal plane. So we're recovering the longitudinal position while also losing the transverse position. So they happen simultaneously, and this is T1 in T2 in a nutshell. And while that is happening, while we're moving upwards, so we're losing transverse and we're recovering longitudinal, this is where we get echoes or signals, and they are picked up by the RF receiver coils, and then they are basically encoded using the gradient coils and Fourier transformation techniques, and then we have an image in front of us in order for us to be able to diagnose. So this in a nutshell is what an MRI scanner is, the main components, what it does, T2 and T1 relaxations, and so much more. I hope you enjoyed this crash course, and more importantly, I hope you got something out of it so that now you understand the MRI medical device. This is just an introduction by myself to get you on to the road of mastering this device. You can head over to bmessentia.com in order for you to be able to study this device at this depth and even more, with 70 plus medical devices, 22 plus different courses from our curriculum, and a bunch of different guides, AI tools, and so much more, which basically make up the world's first biomedical engineering ecosystem, platform, or learning institution, whatever you want to call it. So head over to bmessentia.com and I hope to see you there.